So this chapter is a discussion mostly of blood vessels and the dynamics by which blood fluid travels through those vessels. So in the last chapter, we acknowledged that during physical activity, the sympathetic nervous system is more active. What's the point of this? Well, the sympathetic nervous system is more active during physical activity because mostly it helps increase cardiac output. Okay. How does it do that? How does the sympathetic nervous system increase cardiac output during physical activity? Cardiac output is the amount of blood that's circulating around the body per minute, right? And the amount of blood that's circulating around the body per minute, cardiac output, is heart rate times stroke volume, right? Mostly left ventricular stroke volume. And what we know the sympathetic nervous system does during physical activity to increase cardiac output is, well, it causes both of these values, heart rate and stroke volume, to increase, right? The sympathetic nervous system causes both heart rate and stroke volume to increase during physical activity. And heart rate times stroke volume is cardiac output, the amount of blood that's circulating around the body per minute. So what is the sympathetic nervous system going to do during physical activity, right? It's going to significantly increase cardiac output. And what's the reason for accomplishing that or wanting to do that? Well, because you want more blood to circulate around your body per minute during physical activity, cardiac output. You want more blood to circulate around your body per minute because you want to deliver more blood and thus oxygen to the contracting skeletal muscle fibers throughout the body that need the oxygen to make ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. And there are other cells throughout the body that are going to ultimately need it as well, as you'll see. But there's something missing, right? This doesn't answer everything, and that is, how do we get that increased cardiac output to the right places during physical activity? By that I mean, great, you're engaged in physical activity, the sympathetic nervous system is active, increase in cardiac output, the amount of blood circulating around the body per minute, but how do you get that blood to the specific areas of the body that you actually want it to go to? That's really the point of this lecture, right? Because there are certain areas in the body during physical activity where we don't really need blood to go to, and then there are other areas like contracting skeletal muscle where we really need that blood to be going to. So how do we get the blood to flow towards the areas that need it and perhaps away or not as much towards the areas that don't need it? And that brings us to a completely different question, which is, what is blood flow in the first place? Because if you want to answer how during physical activity, how during physical activity more blood flows towards some areas and less blood flows towards other areas, you of course first have to just ask the simple question of, what is blood flow, right? It might seem like a really simple thing, but it's not, right? This is an actual equation that we need to discuss. The flow of a fluid is not just as simple as saying, well, the fluid flows, right? There are equations that revolve around the flow of fluid through a closed circuit. So to discuss flow, let's start off by talking about the basic anatomy of blood vessels. Okay. Most blood vessels, first of all, are going to have 3 different layers. Okay. You're going to see that there's an inner layer of a blood vessel. You see that here and here, right? This is an artery and this one's a vein. It doesn't matter. If you look at the blood vessel, there's an inner layer. It's called the tunica intima. It's just a layer of simple squamous epithelium. Okay. In vascular physiology and anatomy, that's called the endothelium. Okay, just a layer of simple squamous. It's incredibly important cells, not something that we're really going to focus on much in this class, though. Okay, that's the inner layer. Then there's an outer layer of a blood vessel. Why don't we just draw it in a different color? How about in green? There's the middle layer, excuse me. And the middle layer is called the tunica media. The middle layer of a blood vessel is called the tunica media, and it's made up of smooth muscle. That's the layer that we are going to talk about quite a bit. That layer has the ability to contract and relax because it's muscle. Okay, over here in the vein, here you can see in green, I'm drawing it, the tunica media. The middle layer of a blood vessel, which is made up of smooth muscle. Okay, then how about the outer layer? We can draw that. How about in purple? The outer layer is here in the artery. Here it is in the vein. And that outer layer is called the tunica externa. The tunica externa is really a layer of connective tissue. It helps maintain the integrity of the vessel, connect the vessel to other structures in the body. Another one of the layers that we're really not going to harp on too much. Okay, so these are the three layers that most blood vessels have. They have an inner layer, which is made up of epithelial tissue, very, very small inner layer called the tunica intima, also called the endothelium. Most blood vessels then have a middle layer, which I drew in green, called the tunica media, which is made up of smooth muscle, meaning that it has the ability to contract and relax. That's going to become very important. And then most blood vessels, as we have depicted here, have an outer layer called the tunica externa, which is made up of connective tissue. Another one of these layers that we're not going to focus on too much. So I think I've made it pretty clear. The layer of a blood vessel that we're most interested in for our discussions is what's called the tunica media, this middle layer that is made up of smooth muscle, meaning it has the ability to contract and relax, and as you're going to see in a little bit, change the diameter of the vessel. The middle, the hollow opening of a vessel is called the lumen. And if that tunica media contracts or relaxes, it'll change the diameter of that hollow opening. Right? If the tunica media contracts, then that internal opening, right, the hollow opening in the center called the lumen, if the tunica media contracts, the smooth muscle contracts, then that lumen, that internal hollow opening will narrow. If the tunica media, which is made up of smooth muscle, relaxes, then the opposite will happen, right? The lumen, the hollow opening in the center, will get wider if the smooth muscle, the tunica media, relaxes. We'll get into all of that as the lecture progresses. The first thing that I wanted to do was just review the three basic layers that exist within almost all vessels. Okay? You're going to see that not all these layers exist within what are called capillaries, but most blood vessels have all three of these layers. So next, with regard to vascular anatomy, what we want to do is we just want to review the names of these different vessels. Okay. All I've said so far throughout this class is that arteries take blood away from the heart, veins take blood back towards the heart. That's all I've said. In reality, there are multiple different types of arteries and different types of veins. Okay. I'm not going to ask you to know the different types of arteries besides one. Okay. There's one overarching point that I want to make. When it comes to arteries, they always take blood away from the heart. And as the arteries get further and further away from the heart, they become progressively smaller. Their diameter decreases. The whole vessel itself, the size of it decreases. So obviously, the hollow opening in the center decreases as well. The arteries just get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as they get further and further away from the heart. And the smallest artery that we know of, I shouldn't say, that we know of, it sounds like we don't know all the different types of arteries that there are. The smallest arteries that exist, that's a better way of saying it, are what are called arterioles. Arterioles are the smallest arteries. vessels taking blood away from the heart. Okay, they're incredibly small in terms of their diameter. Each textbook will define it a little bit differently, but I think somewhere between the range of 8 and 100 micrometers is a pretty standard range for the overarching or overall size of an arteriole, which is microscopic. Now, an arteriole still has all of those 3 layers. Arterioles, despite how unbelievably small they are, they still have a tunica intima, a tunica media, and a tunica externa. In fact, their tunica media is proportional to the size of the actual artery. The tunica media is quite large. Okay, so these arterioles have an impressive ability to kind of narrow and dilate, increase and decrease their diameters due to the contraction and relaxation of their tunica medias. And by increase and decrease their diameters, I'm talking about the internal diameter, the lumen, the hollow opening in the center. The size of that within an arteriole can be significantly changed due to whether the tunica media contracts or relaxes. To drive home this point, here's some pictures of the different vessels. Okay, a little confusing because we aren't going through all of the anatomy, but here you can see this one is just labeled an artery. Well, there are really 2 different types of large arteries. There are what are called elastic arteries, which lie right next to the heart. And then as those elastic arteries move away from the heart, they get progressively smaller, but they're still quite large, and they become what are called muscular arteries. And then as the muscular arteries move further and further away from the heart, they get progressively smaller, and eventually the muscular arteries will branch into incredibly small arteries that are called arterioles. I just wanted to show you the difference between a larger artery and an arteriole. An arteriole is clearly much, much smaller than a regular artery, acknowledging the fact that there are even different degrees of sizes with regard to the large arteries. Okay? Arterioles are incredibly small, but you'll notice they have still all 3 layers, tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. And they have a pretty decent tunica media. So that tunica media can contract and relax, and that will change the internal diameter, the lumen. If the tunica media contracts, the internal diameter, the hollow opening in the center, the lumen will become more narrow. And if the tunica media of the arteriole relaxes, then the internal opening, the lumen, the opening in the center, right, it'll increase its diameter. This absolutely happens with larger arteries too. I mean, I think you can tell that due to the fact that the larger arteries also have all 3 layers. You can see they have a lot of smooth muscle within them. But when we talk about the dynamics of blood flow, the contraction and relaxation of the arterial smooth muscle ultimately becomes the most important part of the discussion. Not that contraction of that smooth muscle, the tunica media of the larger arteries isn't important. It's just not the biggest factor, right? So let's keep going. What do the arterioles become? The arterioles become these vessels that are called capillaries. Arterioles branch into what are called capillary beds. Capillaries are the smallest vessels that we know of, and they're neither arteries or veins. We don't say that they take blood away or towards the heart, so we don't define capillaries as either arteries or veins. Okay, so let's look at a capillary bed. Here you can see this would be an arteriole in black here. Okay, that's an arteriole. A very, very small artery, but still has all three layers. Okay, and then you'll notice the arterial turns into this network of vessels that we refer to as a capillary bed. This whole thing right here is a capillary bed, right? Capillaries are the smallest vessels that exist. Maybe calling it a capillary bed is confusing because what it actually means is the arterial just becomes a bed of capillaries, right? The arterial branches into a ton of capillaries, and we just call that group of capillaries a capillary bed, okay? That's what this is right here, right? Now, these capillaries that make up this capillary bed, which is formed from the arterial, these capillaries don't have a tunica media, or much of a tunica externa for that matter either. They're really just a layer of simple squamous, right? All they really are is an endothelium. That's pretty much it. There's a little basement membrane, but I mean these capillaries are incredibly small, and they don't have the three normal layers that a typical vessel would have. They're still considered blood vessels, but they don't have all three layers. And we also don't consider them either arteries or veins. Okay, so what's the point? The point of these capillary beds is the capillary beds will actually lie over tissue. So underneath and around and over this capillary bed, for example, would be muscle tissue, okay? Muscle cells, just tons of muscle cells. Okay? I don't mean a whole muscle, like this isn't going to be the entire biceps muscle, but this capillary bed might lie over, and around a couple hundred skeletal muscle fibers, for example. And what happens is as the blood travels through this network of capillaries called a capillary bed, this is where the actual exchange of nutrients happens. The oxygen can go from the blood in the capillaries into the muscle cells. And the carbon dioxide that's being produced by the muscle cells, for example, can go from the muscle cells into the blood within the capillaries. And this is also how nutrients would get to muscle cells, right? There could be glucose, for example, or fatty acids, or proteins, or whatever, hormones that exist within the blood. This is where the actual fatty acids, glucose, hormones would actually leave the blood. They would leave these capillaries and travel either into or bind to the skeletal muscle cells. Capillaries is where the actual exchange of nutrients and gases happens. That's where the exchange of nutrients and gases between the tissues and the blood actually occurs. And this is clearly depicting what would be the systemic circuit. Okay, because what's happening here? Obviously, the blood is going from being oxygenated to deoxygenated. Now, this would be opposite if it were in the pulmonary circuit. That's not what we're talking about right now. Okay? This is clearly happening in the systemic circuit, right? Because we're going to talk about physical activity. So, oxygenated blood is traveling through the artery, into the arterial, into the capillaries, and then once the oxygenated blood is in the capillaries, the oxygen will actually then go into the skeletal muscle cells, and the carbon dioxide produced by the skeletal muscle cells will go into the blood in the capillaries, and the blood will become deoxygenated. At the proximal end of the capillaries, the blood is oxygenated, and by the time that you get to the distal end of the capillary, or the capillaries in this example, the blood will be deoxygenated. And then what happens? Well, the blood will move, the now deoxygenated blood will move from the distal end of this network of capillaries, and they'll all merge together, and they'll form the smallest veins that we know of, which are called venules. So the same thing is being depicted in this image. Here is a larger artery branching into a progressively smaller artery until it becomes the smallest artery that we know of, which is called an arteriole. Okay. Since this is the systemic circuit that we're discussing here, what's traveling through the larger artery and then the smallest artery that we know of, the arteriole, is oxygenated blood. And then the arteriole branches into these incredibly small vessels called capillaries. They're neither arteries nor veins because of the fact that they're not taking blood away or towards the heart. And the capillaries, additionally, the most important part is once the blood is within the capillaries, this is where the actual exchange of nutrients is going to occur. Assuming this is the systemic circuit as we are, what's going to happen is the oxygenated blood within the capillaries, at least at the proximal end, what's going to happen is the oxygen is going to go from the blood within the capillaries into the cells that lie around the capillaries. And the carbon dioxide being produced by those cells will go from the cells into the blood within the capillaries. And then at the distal end of the capillary bed, the capillaries will now have deoxygenated blood within them. And at the distal end, all of the capillaries will merge together and they'll form what is referred to as a venule. Okay. It's no longer a capillary anymore. When all the capillaries merge at the distal end, they merge together into what's referred to as a venule. What does this mean? Well, now the blood, once it's entered into a venule, it's entered into a vessel that's taking blood back towards the heart. That must mean that venules are a type of vein, which is absolutely true. Venules are the smallest type of vein. They're formed when all of the capillaries merge at the distal end of the capillary bed. That's what forms the venules. And since the blood is now within a vessel that's taking blood back towards the heart, it has to be referred to as a type of vein. That's where the definition comes from. Now, this has nothing to do with why it's defined this way, but venules now also have all three layers typically that a typical vessel has. Like a venule will have a tunica media, it'll have a tunica intima, media, and externa. And we know that the capillaries themselves don't have that. Yet again, that's not why we call a venule a venule. It's not because it has all three layers that a typical vessel does. We call a venule because it's a vessel that's actually taking blood back towards the heart. So a venule is termed a venule because it's a type of vein. It takes blood back towards the heart. Okay, but it's a very, very small type of vein. And what it'll do is it'll merge with other small vessels, and it'll get progressively larger. And venules will become what we refer to as actual true large veins. So venules become what are called true veins. As these veins get closer and closer towards the heart, if this is the systemic circuit, right, these are veins that are headed towards the right atrium carrying deoxygenated blood, because we've been talking about the systemic circuit the entire time. As these veins get closer and closer towards the heart, they get larger and larger and larger and larger and larger. Right? So that's where the anatomy comes from. By anatomy, I mean like anatomical names. Okay, here you can see a venule. These capillaries, which are, it's a bed of capillaries, they merge together to form a venule. Now, you can't really see it, but I can assure you that most venules have some smooth muscle. They have a tunica media. It's just almost non-existent, but it's there. Now, we call them venules because they're a small, very small type of vein that is carrying blood back towards the heart, right? Since the vessel is carrying blood back towards the heart, it has to be a type of vein. It's just a small type of vein. And the venules will become progressively larger as they move closer and closer towards the heart, and they will merge and become what are known as true large veins. And again, assuming that this is the systemic circuit, what's traveling through these veins is deoxygenated blood that will eventually get dumped into the right atrium and then into the right ventricle and then pumped into the pulmonary circuit to be reoxygenated. All right, so there's like 1/10 of the information that you would typically get in an anatomy class with regard to the names of these different vessels. They are necessary to readdress with you or introduce you for those of you, or introduce you to for those of you that haven't taken anatomy, because everything that we're about to talk about with regard to blood flow assumes that you know some of this anatomy. If you have forgotten, which I wouldn't blame you for at this point, what we're actually talking about, it's during physical activity, we know that cardiac output, thanks to the sympathetic nervous system, increases. The amount of blood circulating around the body per minute increases. And what we're trying to talk about in this lecture is how the body gets that extra blood, that extra cardiac output circulating around the body per minute during physical activity to flow towards, let's say, certain specific areas of the body and not towards other areas of the body. And to be able to explain how that blood flows from one area and not so much towards another area, we have to actually define what the flow of a fluid through a closed circuit is mathematically, with an equation. And that was the purpose of talking a little bit about the anatomy of the actual vessels themselves, because to understand this flow equation, you have to know a little bit about the actual structure of these different vessels and the way that they exist in the human body. So what equation do we use to figure out the flow of blood throughout blood vessels, right, throughout the vasculature of the human body? It's the exact same equation that you would use to figure out the flow of a fluid through any pipes that exist within a closed circuit. Because that's what the vasculature, the cardiovascular system is, right? It's essentially just a collection of tubes, pipes that exist within a closed circuit. Like the circuit is closed. So if you want to figure out the flow of blood, what the flow of blood through the cardiovascular system is, the flow of a fluid, blood, throughout a closed circuit, the cardiovascular system, this is the equation that you would use. First of all, the flow of blood throughout the vasculature, throughout the blood vessels of the human body, is always going to be proportional to the pressure gradient between the two sides, in this case, the arteries and the veins. The greater the pressure gradient is between the arteries and the veins, the more flow you will get, right? Because flow is proportional to the pressure gradient. The greater the pressure gradient, the difference in pressure between the arteries and veins, the more flow you will have. Flow in a closed circuit of tubes, vessels, is always proportional to the pressure gradient. The difference in the pressure gradient, the difference in pressure between the two sides, between the two ends. And flow, of a fluid, in this case blood, throughout the vasculature, a closed circuit, is also always inverse to the amount of resistance that exists within the vasculature or within that circuit. Another way of saying that is, the more resistance that you have throughout the cardiovascular system, throughout the vasculature, the more resistance you have, the less flow you will have, because flow is always inverse to resistance with regard to the flow of blood throughout the cardiovascular system, this closed circuit of tubes. So if you actually want to do the equation, this is what it is. Flow equals the pressure gradient meaning the difference in pressure between the two ends divided by the amount of resistance that exists throughout the vasculature, this closed circuit of tubes, vessels. It's the pressure gradient divided by resistance. That is how you determine the flow of blood throughout the vasculature, the cardiovascular system. And the equation itself is unbelievably easy, right? It's basic arithmetic. Like anybody can do it. And that's why I would never ask you to actually do this mathematically on an exam, because of how easy it is. The part that's actually not easy and very difficult to understand is where these ideas and terms of pressure gradient and resistance come from. What do you mean a pressure gradient? The difference in pressure between the arteries and veins. Okay? Where does the idea of pressure even come from? That's a completely different equation. Okay? And where does this idea of resistance come from? What is resistance? Anybody can say the flow of blood through the cardiovascular system equals the pressure gradient divided by the resistance and do it mathematically. It's incredibly easy. The hard part is actually understanding what the pressure gradient is, where it comes from, and understanding what resistance is and where it comes from, and then relating the two to one another and understanding how the relationship between the two dictates blood flow. And that's what we are going to try to do. And by that I mean in the next lecture.